This presentation is really about kind of the word that our entire unit is named after. It's about manifest destiny. It's about that the idea that we have a right to take over the entire continent of North America, and this is kind of the way that we did it. The first thing we need to look at is setting. And the setting of all this, or most of this, is actually a place that was at that point known as Tejas, with the J up there. That's not a typo. That's what it was called. And that was Texas when it was owned by Spain. So it belonged to Spain, Spanish Texas, and it was right along the border of the Louisiana Territory, especially in the southern part of that area. And we were kind of, Zebulon Pike was the first one in there, and we weren't sure if he was spying or not. Okay, but he saw all the land that was there, and he saw that there was really, really good land that people would like a lot. There were forests and plains and good soil, so it was a really good place for farming, and there were a lot of resources available in the area. There were also a bunch of different rivers flowing through this area that had ports, so they went all the way out to the Gulf of Mexico. And if you look at a map, the Gulf of Mexico is that big open area by Texas and by Florida and all that has access to the ocean to get over to Europe, which is a really, really important thing for trade. The thing about Spanish Texas is there weren't that many white people there. Okay, there weren't that many Spanish people there. Most of the people that were there were actually Native American, and this was kind of a little bit of a problem for the Spanish. But the Americans started to try to come in and take over some of this land. They would just go in there and they'd say, "Oh, this is our land," and they would make a farm there or whatever it was. And the Spanish soldiers would have to kind of drive them off. They'd say, it's not part of your country. You can't just come in and take land. It's not part of America. And so they just continually had to do it. It was like swatting flies. It was really annoying to have to keep kicking these Americans off their land. The Spanish people that lived in Texas were the Tejanos. And there were about 4,000 of them that lived there. But the Spanish really wanted more Tejanos to live there. They wanted more people to go there and populate this area. And the reasons that they wanted it are right here. Okay, the first one, they wanted to be able to help defend their people against the Native Americans. The Native Americans wanted their land back, and so sometimes they would attack, and the Tejanos, there weren't very many of them to fight against whole Indian tribes. The second thing was they wanted to defend against the Americans who kept coming in, because that was so annoying. These Americans kept trying to come in and say, "This is my farm," and they'd say, "Nope, not your country." Okay, and so they would have to fight them off or tell them to leave, and it was just really difficult to defend that border. The last thing that it's not really a reason they wanted it, but it's one of the incentives they gave. Okay, they gave the incentive that we will give any Spanish citizen land that wants to live in Texas, in Tejas. Okay, and so they offered free land to these people, but none of them wanted to go out and risk their lives in this new piece of land. And so, like I said, only about 4,000 Tejanos were living in that region at this time. And so there was an American named Moses Austin. And this is a picture of Moses Austin right here. But he asked the Spanish government if he could set up a colony in Texas. Okay, he said, "I would like to, bring some people down. We'd like to take some of the land and have our own little colony." And Spain said, "Sure, you can come in and do that. We'll make that work, except for you basically have to become Spanish citizens. You have to follow the Spanish laws. You have to act in the right way. You got to do all of these things." Okay, and he said, "Sure, this is such good land. I really want to do it." The problem was he died before he was able to set it all completely up. After Moses Austin died, his son Stephen Austin took over his father's dream. Okay. And even though Stephen Austin really didn't have that much interest in doing this, he didn't want his father's legacy and everything his father had worked for. He didn't want that dream of his father's to die. And so even though he wanted to become a lawyer, he decided he would take over what his father had started. And so he got his guys together and was ready to move down there. And then Mexico fought a war against Spain, and they got their independence from them. And so now, instead of Texas belonging to Spain, now Texas belonged to Mexico, a new country. And so he had to ask the Mexican government for the land now instead of the Spanish government, because that old agreement was gone, right? The whole country was not part of that anymore, so the old agreement was gone. And so the Mexican government said, sure, but here's the caveats. Here's what I'm going to make you do. You have to be a Mexican citizen. Okay, so you have to follow our laws and all that kind of stuff. You also have to be a member of the Roman Catholic Church. I believe on your notes there's a bullet point for Mexican citizen and a bullet point for Roman Catholic Church. So they have to become Catholics. They have to become Mexican citizens. Okay, and Stephen Austin's rule was it was called they were the first people down there were called the Old 300 because he only allowed people who's the heads of family, so the father figure, was moral, meaning a good person, was hardworking, and did not drink alcohol because he didn't want there to be any problems in this new colony. And when they moved down there and set it up, it was kind of interesting because all these people were such good people that they didn't even have to put locks on their doors. All they did was they put a pin in it so that it would close or stay closed. They didn't have to lock up their doors because there wasn't any crime at the beginning. But very quickly, because it was such good land, the population started to swell. And once the Mexicans let the Americans in, the Americans just kept coming and kept coming and kept coming. And so very quickly it went from 300 up to 30,000 people living in Texas. And so with all of these Americans living in Mexico, in this new country, new part of Mexico, there were problems because there were more Americans there than there were Mexicans. And so the Americans had some problems at first. They did not like following the Mexican laws when they went to court, when they had to fill out paperwork, all that kind of stuff. It was in Spanish, and they didn't speak Spanish, and so they had a hard time with that. So that was a big deal for them. And the last thing was, most of them had slaves and wanted slavery. And Mexico had banned slavery. They didn't want slavery at all. And so at first, Mexico was kind of, we're just going to let that go and not fight the fight up there because we don't have that many people. But eventually, they wanted to crack down on that idea that they wanted to completely get rid of slavery. They did not like slavery at all. And so that was kind of three of the big problems the Americans had with Mexico. The Tejanos, those people that were now Mexican, right? The Mexican people living in Texas were mad too. They said they thought the Americans felt superior. Oh, you don't want to speak our language. You don't want to follow our laws. That's unfair. If you think you're better than us, then go back to America. If you want this to be America, get out of our country. Okay? And so eventually it got very heated and very angry, and so Mexico cracked down. They made two different policies that kind of cracked down on this. The first one was no new Americans can move into this colony. So they disallowed any new Americans from moving in, and they started for the very first time to tax these people. So basically the biggest tax that they were doing was they would have extremely high taxes, so they would have to pay a lot of money to bring in goods and buy stuff from America. And so they had this big tariff, which hurt these people the most because they were bringing all of their goods in from the people they knew in America. And so these American Texans and the Tejanos that were there as well kind of almost teamed up in Texas, and they said, we really need to we'll still be part of Mexico, but we want to kind of be our own state in Mexico and separate, and we want to have more representation. So we want to have our own little government, and we want to be represented in the Mexican government. And so they sent a letter out and said, said that they wanted this and they thought this was fair and they wanted to have a say. And so when it got to the Mexican government, the government agreed. They said, yeah, that doesn't actually sound too bad. We can do that. But then General Santa Anna found out about a letter that was sent. And the letter that was sent to America. And it was saying that if Mexico doesn't agree to let us be a state, then we are going to break off from them and fight against them. And this made General Santa Anna, who was trying to become basically, and did become, like a dictator of Mexico, a military dictator of Mexico, this made him very, very mad. And so he sent troops in to Texas, and he said, you know, give us our weapons back. You can't defend yourself with our weapons anymore. You're going to break off. We don't want you to have, you know, these cannons and guns that we've given you. And so he sent his troops in to take a cannon back from the city of Gonzales. Okay, and so he asked for it back, and basically the Texan said, well, if you want it, come and get it. Come and take it from us. Okay, and so Santa Anna sent troops in, tried to take it from them, and failed. The Texans were able to hold on to the cannon and fight off the Mexican troops. And so the Texans drove the troops out of Gonzales and drove them out of this old mission called the Alamo. Okay, and as they now had the Alamo, which was kind of fortified, and they could kind of defend their position from there. They ended up gathering about 185 volunteers from America that came down, and some Tejanos that gathered in there and were willing to defend it against the Mexican army. After this fighting, Texas declared their freedom from Mexico. They said, we are free from Mexico. It's done. Okay, and so when they did this, Sam Houston was put in charge of the army. His name was Sam Houston, and you probably know this because Houston, Texas is named after him. So you've heard that name before. You've heard Houston at least. Okay, and so what he did with his army is he split it into two forces. He put 420 of his men at a fort in the south, and he had 180, like I said, it was about 185 actually, volunteers in the Alamo. And these volunteers in the Alamo included these three men here. Okay, their leader was William Travis. He was the leader of the Alamo. He made all of the decisions. And then there were some American almost folk heroes there, these people that we see as heroes now in our history, and they were Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett. And Jim Bowie was known best for having this enormous knife, a really, really big knife that was, you know, almost like the size of a machete, a big old hunting knife that was huge. And so now we call that a Bowie knife, named after him because he's, you know, one of the American folk heroes. And then Davy Crockett was this mountain man from America, and you know, there were all these stories about him. He was like the Chuck Norris of their time. Like he had fought a bear with his bare hands and won, and all these different stories that were, you know, probably not true, but he was seen, there were books written about him. He was seen as this mountain man, folk hero, really, really tough guy. And so all three of these guys were among the 185 volunteers in the Alamo. And what happened is there were thousands of Mexican troops that came in and attacked the Alamo. And what William Travis said is, I shall never surrender or retreat. And so he was basically saying, if you're going to have to fight us, and if we don't win, we might die, but we're not going to give up, and we're not going to run away. Okay, and so they ended up fighting the thousands of Mexicans against 185 volunteers in the Alamo, and they lasted for 12 days until they ran out of ammunition, until they had no more bullets, no more cannonballs, nothing left to fire at the Mexicans. The Mexicans came in, and during the final fight, all but 5 of the Americans died during the fighting. Those last 5 Americans that were left behind were all executed. There was no mercy given by General Santa Anna. And this caused tons of volunteers from America to hear about this heroism, these people giving their lives, and they came down to volunteer and join the Texas Army. With this big loss, the Texas Army started to retreat. Those 420 that were left behind started to retreat. And like I was saying, all of these people started to come in from America and surrounding areas and volunteer for the Texas Army because of what they did at the Alamo. And so as they were retreating and running away, the army just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually it grew to about 800 men on the way while they're running away. And eventually they got far enough ahead that they started to realize, we have a pretty big force. Maybe we should just fight and stop retreating. Okay, and so they stopped at the San Jacinto River, which is really close to Houston, Texas. Okay, they stopped there and they turned around and got prepared to fight against Santa Anna. And so it was kind of like a sneak attack. Even though Santa Anna knew he was running after them and trying to catch them, they had stopped, and instead of having their backs turned, they were turned around and ready to fight. And they attacked with an extreme vigor, meaning they attacked really hard and really fast. And they were all screaming out, "Remember the Alamo, remember the Alamo, remember the Alamo," because they wanted everyone to remember how heroic those 185 people were. And if they could hold out against the whole Mexican army, then 800 should be able to beat them. And so within 18 minutes of the beginning of this battle, half of the Mexicans were dead, and the Texans had captured Santa Anna. They had captured the leader of Mexico. And so basically at gunpoint, they forced Santa Anna to sign a treaty, and that treaty recognized that Texas was its own country. So we know Texas now as kind of the Lone Star Republic because they were one time their own country, a republic. And so Texas was its own country, not part of America, not part of Mexico. They were their own country for a while. They had their very own army, their very own navy. They had their own president. This man right here, Sam Houston, who used to be in charge of the army, was the president of Texas. And a lot of people in America wanted them to be part of America. They wanted America to say, okay, we will annex you and we'll take you in. And really, Texas wanted to be part of America too. But there were some people that did not want that, especially the Americans in the North didn't want it. Okay, and the problem that they had is we do not want to add a new state that wants slavery, that's under the Missouri Compromise line, so they should be allowed to have slavery if they want to. And it would just be this huge political battle that would tear the country apart. And so Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren would not annex them because they said this is going to be a huge political fight. It's going to split the country and it's going to tear us apart. And so the Lone Star Republic, Texas, remained its own country for 10 years before it was annexed into the U.S. So after the ninth president, John Tyler, James K. Polk came in and was fighting in an election. And basically, there were a bunch of people that were trying to become the president, but everybody kind of thought, well, the person who's going to become the president is going to be Henry Clay. Everybody knows Henry Clay. He's definitely going to win it, and he's been such a good politician and everything like that. And so what they came into this election, the election of 1844. And a really, really big issue was, should we take Texas and annex it or should we not? And, Henry Clay was trying to avoid the issue. He didn't want to be a part of it. He's this compromiser guy. He just didn't want to be a part of it. And so when he spoke, he tried to avoid it. But James K. Polk never avoided it once. Okay, he said, when we come in, I will take over Texas and I will take over the area of Oregon, and our country will go all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. We'll take over the whole continent. We'll take over absolutely everything. And so people liked that. And this guy that basically nobody even knew about, okay, all of a sudden won the election and became the president of the United States. And so, during this time, there was this term that we use today and that they used back then, which was called manifest destiny. And it came from a reporter named John O'Sullivan, who wrote in one of his articles, "Our manifest destiny is to overspread the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and self-government." So, this is crazy, right? This is a hard thing to understand. But if we look at it in pieces, our manifest destiny, so our destiny is to overspread the whole of the continent. So that means we are going to take over the entire continent, okay, which Providence has given us. Okay, and providence is a religious word, meaning basically that God has given us the right to do it. So we're going to take over the whole continent because God has given us this continent. And the reason he gave us this continent is to keep working on the experiment of liberty and self-government, so of freedom and democracy. So basically, the manifest destiny, the entire idea of the manifest destiny is that God said that we should take over this whole continent. He gave us this continent so that we could continue work on being a free and democratic country. And so manifest destiny, if I had to make it kind of simple, it would be this on the bottom of the slide. Manifest destiny is that expansion is good. We need to expand. We need to get bigger. And it's bound to happen. And it's bound to happen. It's already decided by God. And so I would definitely include by God on my definition of manifest destiny. One of Polk's slogans was talking about the land in Canada, and his slogan was 54-40 or fight. And so basically that was saying that we want all the land all the way up to the 54th parallel, 54 which means 54 degrees north and 40 minutes, which we'll learn a little bit more about latitude and longitude next year. But what he ended up doing is he settled for the 49th parallel, which was kind of agreed upon already in the Rush-Bagot Agreement. And so instead of taking over like half of Canada, which would have been what 54-40 would have meant, he ended up settling for what the border is today, which is the 49th parallel. And this happened in the Treaty of 1846. And so that gave us the rights, and that gave America the rights to the state of Washington, the state of Oregon, and part of Idaho. And so now we had reached the Pacific Ocean. We owned land all the way across the north from the Atlantic Ocean, New York, all the way out to Seattle to the Pacific Ocean. And after that, he also went through on his promise to annex Texas. And this was kind of a problem, though, because Mexico thought it's still ours. You know, they made us do it. They made us sign this thing at gunpoint. This is terrible, right? And so they thought it was kind of an act of war. And Mexico and Texas also had a problem with where is the border? Where is the border between Mexico and Texas? And so if you look at this map, this kind of shows what the difference in opinion on the border was. Okay, this area over here is the United States. It has nothing to do with this conversation. Okay, this dark green in the middle is what Texas was. Okay, this red over here was what Texas thought it was theirs and Mexico thought it was theirs. And so like half of the Republic of Texas was disputed because what they thought is Mexico thought the Nueces River right here was the border between Texas and Mexico, and America thought the Rio Grande, or not America, Texas thought the Rio Grande was their border. And so this was a really, really big dispute, and it got really kind of contentious very quickly. So James K. Polk, as he was about to annex Texas and bring it into his country, he knew that the Mexican government really, really needed some money. And so he said, listen, guys, we'll just buy this land from you. We're going to buy Texas, New Mexico, California, this whole area, okay? And we'd like to buy it for about $25 million, okay? And we know you need money, and so let's do it instead of fighting a war over it. And Mexico was offended, and so they refused the offer. They said, no, you're going to have to fight us for it. And so America sent in Zachary Taylor and some troops to the Rio Grande to quote unquote defend the border. Now, was he really defending the border? It's kind of a tricky question because we thought that was the border, but Mexico thought that was part of Mexico. And so when he sent his troops in there into what Mexico thought was their land, they saw it as an act of war. And so they came in and they attacked that American patrol and ended up killing 16 Americans. And Congress immediately declared war because they said, quote, they have spilled American blood on American soil. They have killed Americans in America, and that's not acceptable, and so we're going to go to war with them. Now, did they really? I mean, I would say no. Like, this was the contentious area, right? This is where, the area that they were fighting over. America should have known that they shouldn't have been there until they had decided where the border was. And so really it was kind of a setup to start a war. When deciding to go to the war, there were some people who were for it and some people who were against it, and it kind of went right along the lines of slavery versus anti-slavery people. In the South and in the West, where slavery was big, they wanted the war. They wanted more land, they wanted cheap land, and they wanted, it's more slavery states, and so they liked the idea of getting more southern land. The anti-slavery states didn't like it because they said, Polk kind of started this war. He sent his troops into an area that they knew that they were fighting over. And so he provoked it. He made it happen. And so General Zachary Taylor, nonetheless, they went to war, and General Zachary Taylor led his troops into Mexico from the north. And General Stephen Kearny decided that he was going to go west, or they decided that he was going to go west and try to capture New Mexico and California. He made it into New Mexico, and he kind of tricked the government into letting him come in, saying we're just passing through, whatever. And then when he got in there, he had enough troops that the Mexicans knew that they would lose that fight, and so he didn't even have to fire a single shot, and he took over all of New Mexico. Just kind of through trickery, and then he started to send a small force over to California to liberate them and take them back from Mexico. Little did Stephen Kearny know, but Mexico had already put together a group of settlers in the San Francisco area, and they had already fought back themselves, and they had put together their own flag right up here, okay, with a bear on it, and they got a bunch of settlers together, and they attacked the Mexicans on their own to help out the American army. And so after a little while, within that first week or two, they had captured the Mexican commander in California. And California had a very small Mexican presence. There were not a lot of army people in it, but this small group of people that were living out there had taken over and taken the Mexican commander. Okay, and so their flag with a bear on it, just like the flag of California has now, it's kind of modeled after this flag. They had gotten freedom from Mexico, and so they started to call themselves the Republic of California, meaning they were also thinking maybe we'll be our own country, okay, kind of like Texas was. But a man named John C. Fremont took charge of these settlers, these rebels, and had them go down and join the American troops. And within a couple of weeks after those settlers joined the troops, all of California was controlled by America. So we had all of our land in Mexico, in what is America today, okay, but in order to really win this war and get Santa Anna to back down, we had to defeat them in Mexico. And so we decided to invade Mexico, and we knew the Mexican army was bigger, they had more troops than us, but we had really well trained officers because they had just been trained by the people that were fighting in the War of 1812 against America. Or sorry, not against America, that's silly, against the British. And so the other thing that they had was much better weapons than the Mexicans had. And so they invaded from two directions. General Zachary Taylor invaded from the north, and General Winfield Scott went around on his boats and invaded from the south. And so when General Taylor invaded from the north, he came down south and won a battle against Santa Anna at the Battle of Buena Vista with a much smaller group of troops. And General Winfield Scott came in from the south, and he took over Mexico City, and Taylor was coming from the north, and Winfield Scott was coming from the south, and they squeezed in on this very old, kind of like almost like the Alamo, right? It was a stone castle type thing, okay, called Chapultepec, and the Mexicans fought to the very end, kind of like the Alamo. Chapultepec was like Mexico's Alamo, and these people are seen as heroes in their history. And so eventually, however, with a big fight and a lot of Americans dying, they did defeat the Mexican forces at Chapultepec and won the war. So the war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo did a number of things. First off, it ended the war. The war was over. Okay. The second thing that it did is it said Mexico recognizes that Texas, the entire state of Texas, belongs to the United States, and that the border is not the Nueces River, it is the Rio Grande River, just like we said at the beginning. Okay. The other thing that it did is it had it involved something called the Mexican Cession. And the Mexican cession means to give something up. You're ceding something, you're giving it up. Okay? And so they had to give us California, Nevada, so right here, California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. Okay, and so we got all of this land from them for winning the war, but because we didn't want to leave them completely done, we had just taken half of Mexico from them. Okay, we didn't want to leave them just screwed over, and so we did give them some money. We ended up giving Mexico $15 million for that land that we had offered $25 million before for. After this treaty went through, Mexico realized they needed even more money. America realized that the best way to get a railroad in the southern part of America, all the way from one end of the country to the other, was through a mountain pass in this area. And so what we had to end up doing is buying that little tiny chunk of land, okay, in order for us to put in that railroad, because otherwise we were running into mountains and canyons, and it was really, really difficult to do it anywhere else. And so we bought this tiny little brown piece of land on the bottom, the Gadsden Purchase, for about $10 million. And so all together, this entire red and brown piece of land right here ended up costing us $25 million, exactly what we offered before the war was fought, before people died. Okay, and so it could have been settled with just the money going through, but instead the pride didn't allow us to do that, and we ended up fighting a war. Okay, but it's kind of funny that this purchase that we made only cost us $10 million for that little tiny brown piece of land, but after winning the war, that whole red area cost us only $15 million.